Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the third annual CBA Mid-Atlantic Regional Meeting Reboot on the beautiful campus of Villanova University here in Philadelphia. I am Dr. Archie Wright. I am the Executive Director of CBA, and I will be your host this weekend. And I will be moderating the panel discussion this evening, which I'm really excited about and looking forward to. Much of what happens here tonight and tomorrow would not happen without Joshua Scott. Joshua is the Director of Events and Technology for CBA, and also with the help of Lisa Tarker, who is our Executive Office Manager in the DC area. But I also especially want to thank our organizing team here from Villanova, Peter Spittler and Elizabeth Schrader-Pulitzer, and also Melissa Lord. But I don't believe Lisa, she's probably smart enough to stay home. So we have a great panel to kick off things tonight and a great lineup of papers tomorrow. And I'm very much looking forward to meeting those of you who I do not know or have not met before. So please come up and say hello sometime this weekend. I want to quickly go over a few technical things that Joshua has given me orders to do. So please check the CBA website for the schedule of presentations, meals, breaks, and receptions. You don't want to miss the receptions, which we have one this evening. Please wear your name tags. We all like to think the universe revolves around us, but some of us don't remember that, and we may have forgotten your name, so probably wear your name tag. Receptions, breaks, breakfast, and lunch are provided with your registration, but you are on your own for dinner on Saturday night. As you know, hybrid meetings can have some glitches, so there may be moments we have to pause to help those who are online to connect with us, or there may be some glitches here in this room, so please be patient with us. All handouts and presentation aids will be presented on the screen unless they are provided by the speaker. So we're trying to save trees as much as possible. You who are not yet CBA members, you're missing out on lots of opportunities. I don't have time at the moment to tell you all about those opportunities, but there is a brochure at the registration table, or you can ask me later. So please come and talk to me. During the Q&A tonight or tomorrow, if you're in the audience and asking a question, please stand up, give your name, and please speak directly into the microphone. Makes things a lot easier so that everyone can hear you. We do have ceiling microphones in the rooms, but we want to make sure that everyone who is online and everyone in the room can hear your question. One more thing, don't forget our annual general meeting is fast approaching. It will take place at Loyola University, Maryland in Baltimore, and registration will be opening soon. Now it is my honor to introduce Dr. Kevin Hughes, Chair of the Theology and Religious Studies Department at Villanova University, to welcome us. Dr. Hughes.
Archie. Well, thank you. Thank you, Archie. Thank you, John. Thanks, everybody, for being here. It is good for us to be here together. As Archie said, I'm Kevin Hughes. I'm professor of historical theology here at Villanova University and currently serving as chair of our Department of Theology and Religious Studies. And on behalf of our department and our colleagues, our dean, Dr. Adele Lindenmeyer, our provost, Dr. Pat Magidi, and our president, Father Peter Donahue, it is really my pleasure to welcome you here to Villanova. I'd love to welcome you in the name of our most famous alumnus, His Holiness, but I'm not quite authorized to do so, but I'm sure he's happy that you're here too. I know, right? No, but seriously, folks, we are blessed by your presence here with us and by the great and good work you already have done and that you will do together. I was thinking about this weekend's gathering, and when I was listening to today's gospel reading from the Gospel of Mark for the third Friday of Lent, when Jesus is asked by a scribe, which is the first of the commandments? And Jesus responds, it seems worthy to note, first of all, with the Shema, right? Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. And then as we know, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your mind, and all your strength. And the second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. Now, I confess, everything I know that's interesting about the Gospel of Mark, I learned from Dr. Paul Danov, my colleague of many years, who will be here tomorrow, so you should listen to him rather than me. I may be the least qualified person in the room here to say anything of interest, scholarly interest at least, about the New Testament, and I will not venture to try. But I imagine this scene in the Gospel today where we meet Jesus in this act of biblical interpretation, in a kind of chavruta, right? This sort of shared fellowship over study of the scriptures with a partner in dialogue. And when Jesus gives his answer, he gives more than he was asked. He was asked, what's the greatest? And he gives two, right? And then the scribe says, well, teacher, you are right. And Jesus' reply, you are not far from the kingdom. It's one of the happiest dialogues in the New Testament, right? You know, really, that's certainly the scribes. So my hope and prayer for you, for us here tonight, and for you this weekend, is that you share in a little spirited chavruta of your own, in a little tussling fellowship of study over the scriptures. And that in your exchange, in the back and forth of conversation over the scriptures, you may help us all be just a little closer to the kingdom. So again, my friends, welcome to Villanova. May the delights and rewards of shared study bear fruit for you and for the church and for the world. Thank you for being here with us.
Okay, I would like to welcome our panel to come and take a seat. It's not mine. I want to thank Dr. Mark Smith for telling me to type out my notes tonight of introduction, because he knows and I know I have a habit of rambling when I'm introducing stuff, because thoughts pop into my head and, oh, I should tell him about this, or I should tell him about this. But thank you, Mark. It went a lot smoother and I appreciate it. And I'm sure all of you do too. So it is indeed my pleasure to introduce our panel tonight with Dr. Byron Ritchie. I had to ask him how to pronounce his name because I don't know. And all I have to think about is chewing tea now to get it right. So, and our two panelists, Dr. Andre Price and Dr. Leslie Renelson, both incidentally from United Lutheran Seminary, which was accidental, I guess, because we didn't have that plan. So it's kind of interesting, but this is going to be fun. I'm really looking forward to it. So first I want to introduce Dr. Andre Price. He's a visiting assistant professor. I do have this typed out, of systematic theology and African-American studies, and the director of student affairs and retention at United Lutheran Seminary in Philadelphia. He is a Louisville Institute postdoctoral fellow with research interests in Black theology, political theology, and pneumatology and race. His work focuses on building bridges between the church and the academy, while serving as a senior pastor in Philadelphia. Dr. Leslie Vernelson teaches courses in Hebrew Bible and Old Testament at United Lutheran Seminary in Philadelphia. She earned her PhD and MDiv from Princeton Theological Seminary. In 2024-25, Leslie was a Democracy Fellow at Interfaith America, where she worked with the civic team to support communities and people of faith, building bridges across religious and political divides, promoting trustworthy information about the political process, and engaging in interfaith civic projects and for common good. She also served as the interim director of the Center of Theology for Women and Gender at PTS from 2020 to 2023, organizing events and curricula to educate public and scholarly audiences on the intersection of religion and gender. Now, our presenter tonight, Dr. Archie earned his PhD in 2024 from Boston College, his MDiv in 2018 from Emory University Chandler School of Theology, and also his Juris Doctorate in 2008 from the University of South Carolina. Somebody crazy enough to get 2 doctorates. Byron is a systematic and comparative theologian who researches and teaches in spirituality, theology, Black religion, and African studies. As a legal scholar and ethicist, Byron also focuses on the relationship of law, religion, and morality, particularly in the context of war and racialized violence. So Byron, I welcome you to come and present. Thank you so much.
A charge to keep, covenant theology, the rule of law, and fidelity. A charge to keep I have, a God to glorify, a never-ending soul, a never-dying soul to save, and fit for the sky. To serve the present age, my calling to fulfill, O may it all my powers engage to do my master's will. Arm me with watchful care, as in thy sight to live, and now thy servant, Lord, prepare a strict account to give. Help me to watch and pray, and still on thee rely. O let me not my trust betray, but press to realms on high. As a Black theologian, I take Black folks as my starting point for theology. I wholeheartedly agree with Black Catholic and womanist theologian Diana Hayes that Black theology does not begin with an academic method, but rather with a people. And so I can't help but begin to imagine a communion of Black saints, formerly enslaved children, women, and men, preachers and priests, abolitionists and soldiers, civil rights and Black Lives Matter protesters, singing across the ages, a charge to keep I have, a God to glorify. Oh, let me not my trust betray, but press to realms on high. Frederick Douglass famously asked, what to the slave is the 4th of July? And I wonder to myself, what to the communion of U.S. Black American Christians is the rule of law? During the Great Awakening, many enslaved Africans converted to evangelical Christianity. The movement's religious enthusiasm called for more lively music than the hymns then in use. So English writers like Isaac Watts, a Baptist, and Charles Wesley, a Methodist, wrote most of the hymns, tunes, texts during the Great Awakening. Wesley wrote A Charge to Keep, and its lyrics are based on Matthew Henry's commentary on Leviticus 8:35. In the scripture, Moses is speaking to Aaron and his son during their ordination to the priesthood. In the King James Version of the Bible, the scripture reads as follows. Therefore shall we abide at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation day and night 7 days, and keep the charge of the Lord, that ye die not. for so I am commanded. Matthew Henry's commentary in pertinent parts says, we have, every one of us, a charge to keep, an eternal God to glorify, an immortal soul to provide for, needful duty to be done, our generation to serve, and it must be our daily charge, our daily care to keep this charge. For it is the charge of the Lord our Master, who will shortly call us to account about it, and it is at our peril if we neglect it. Keep it that ye die not. It is death, eternal death, to betray the trust we are charged with. Wesley literally used Henry's words almost verbatim. When I was a young child, my all-Black congregation would slowly and contemplatively raise or sing this hymn or scripture commentary, raising or lining a hymn. This is a call and response liturgical practice in which a cantor reads portion of a hymn text and the congregation responds by singing it on the pentatonic scale. For the newly converted African Christians and their Black offsprings, the hymn conveys a simple message: keep the Lord's charge and avoid death. The year 2026 marks the 250th anniversary of the United States founding, when the Second Continental Congress declared the independence of the 13 British colonies from Great Britain on July 4th, 1776, in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. Along with patriotic celebrations, political anniversaries provide a meaningful occasion to reflect on and reinterpret the nation's story. It offers a chance for people constituted as a constitutional democratic republic to decide what past it endorses, what present successes and shortcomings it acknowledges, and which future ambitions it renews. The fact that the United States semi-quincentennial celebration coincides with ongoing disputes over congressional delegations of power, presidential overreach, illegitimate war fighting, voter suppression, and economic uncertainty makes this moment especially significant. Since the January 6th invasion of the United States Capitol, as I like to refer to it, the Epiphany insurrection, we have observed not just partisan division, but also structural vulnerability within a nation's commitment to the rule of law. These debates and the signs of constitutional vulnerability have highlighted a persistent constitutional issue: whether law ultimately limits power, or whether during emergencies and under charismatic leadership, power reshapes law. To put it another way, is the US constitutional democracy a government ruled by law or powerful men? At the same time, the centennial of organized Black History Month observations, which began with Carter G. Woodson in 1926, underscores the constitutional self-understanding and the rule of law remain deeply contested in the United States. To tell the story of 250 years of US constitutionalism without addressing the lasting effects of slavery, Reconstruction, disenfranchisement, and civil rights would overlook a crucial part of our civic history. Laws have served a dual purpose as both a tool of racial oppression and a way to promote freedom and equality. The obligation to present the national story from alternative and marginalized viewpoints is not a side duty, but a core part of constitutional fidelity. And so it is against the backdrops of these two anniversaries, I present a threefold argument that I hope you'll find interesting and insightful. The first part draws on biblical theology, or a theology, quote, grounded quite strictly in the exegesis of the biblical text and their clearest implication, unquote. Or, to be more precise, It draws on a covenant theology of the Hebrew Bible as outlined by John Levinson in The Love of God. In the Hebrew Bible, the observance of mitzvah, law, or precepts is not conceptually or theologically separated from covenant love and fidelity. Instead, the law constitutes the public grammar of relational fidelity. The second part of the argument draws on U.S. American legal jurisprudence, or the philosophy of law, and Catholic virtue ethics. The presentation explores the three major jurisprudential traditions of the U.S. legal theory: legal positivism, natural law, and critical legal theories. I focus particularly on the work of Ronald Dworkin. Unlike legal positivists who distinguish law from morality, Dworkin advocates for a secular natural law perspective of the law as integrity. The law must align with previous legal narratives and should not significantly conflict with a fair understanding of our current political morality. As a Black Catholic, I see a virtue ethic within Levinson's covenantal theology and Dworkin's secular natural law. And then finally, in part 3, I take a turn back to my people, to Africana studies and critical race legal theory, to explore how the covenantal framework illuminates both the moral aspirations and the structural limitations of the American rule of law, particularly through the consideration of the Civil War, the Reconstruction Amendments, and contemporary debates over sovereignty. Ultimately, the goal is not to promote an analogical piety or to sacralize the U.S. constitutional order, God forbid, but to carry out a disciplined comparison that clarifies how communities are maintained by binding norms and how those norms are held accountable to higher standards of justice. Part 1, the theological, legal, and moral dimension of covenant in the Hebrew Bible. In The Love of God, Levinson explores how the Shema and Deuteronomy theology expresses a central element in covenant: faithfulness and alliance. For Levinson, this fidelity in the covenant between the sovereign God and Israel is expressed through the phrase, the love of God, which Levinson used to elucidate covenant love. Biblical scholarship helps us to see that in its ancient Western Asian or Near Eastern context, a covenant is a kind of treaty that establishes or formalizes a relationship and spells out the obligations within the alliance. Building on the insights of renowned Assyriologist William L. Morin, Levinson observes, that was a plug for the Catholics, but Levinson observes that in Deuteronomy, God's commands love and affection and for love or affection are expressed through unquestioning obedience to the law. The command to love reflects the nature of the relationship as a suzerainty covenant between unequal partners rather than a parity covenant between equal partners. A suzerainty covenant best explains the relationship between God and Israel. God is the Lord, and Israel is the subordinate vassal. And in unequal relationships, a covenant calls for exclusivity. Without it, the alliance risks breaking down. Setting aside all ideas of treaty-like alliances between unequals, Levinson portrays a covenant love as obligatory and driven by legal actions that are covenant loves Levinson's portrayal of covenant laws as obligatory are driven by legal actions, and driven by legal actions raises a question: how can one command another to love? For a modern audience that views love as romantic and affectionate, the command to love appears inconsistent, abnormal, and jarring. And Levinson explains that in Deuteronomy theology, a legal dimension of the love of God, defined by a set of actions, is grounded in the national story of the Hebrew Bible, the sovereign God's unprovoked, unmerited, and undeserved hesed, or loving kindness for Israel, God's vassal. The gift of land and liberation should evoke gratitude in Israel towards the Lord God. Levinson quotes in pertinent part Deuteronomy 6, 10, and 15. Quote, when the Lord your God had brought you into the land that he swore to your ancestors, to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to give you a land with fine, large cities that you did not build, houses filled with all sorts of goods that you did not fill, huge cisterns that you did not hew, gardens and olive groves that you did not plant. And when you have eaten your fill, take care that you do not forget the Lord, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. The Lord your God, you shall fear. Him you shall serve, and by his name alone you shall swear. Do not follow other gods, any of the gods of the people who are all around you, because the Lord your God, who is present with you, is a jealous God. The anger of the Lord your God will be kindled against you, and he would destroy you from the face of the earth. Before establishing the covenant, the Sinai covenant, which reflects the legal aspects of God's love and the love God receives from Israel, God gives Israel with loving kindness by making them a landed and liberated people. The unearned nature of the gifts means that Israel's relationship with God is not a reward for following the law. According to Levinson, the legal dimension of the covenant is rooted in the virtue of gratitude, which is closely associated with the virtue of humility. The covenant's legal dimension is grounded in the affective and moral response to give thanks for God's loving kindness. The legal dimension of the laws are properly seen, to me, as a virtue ethic of gratitude. Moreover, because Israel's election or chosenness, a defining aspect of the character of their character as a people, is based on the grace of God, as Levinson says, quote, the grace of God alone, with no merit of their own to justify it, unquote. Humility should also undergird their national story and character. In covenantal logic, law is not the precondition for alliance with God or national belonging, but rather a moral response to understanding love and belonging. Part 2, U.S. American constitutionalism and the rule of law. Defining the rule of law is complicated. The American Bar Association cautions us not to attempt to separate the rule of law from the people who make up government and society. The rule of law is relational. At its core, it clarifies a person's relationship to a sovereign. In the American Anglo legal tradition, the rule of law finds its earliest expression in the 1215 Magna Carta, in which King John of England formally recognized in writing the rights of the barons. According to legal historian John W. Baldwin, the law of the land, the lex terra, had developed in England since Anglo-Saxon times and evolved into the English common law through Latin Christendom's international canon law, which drew inspiration from the ancient Roman Empire's Jewish comity, or the common law, which is not to be mistaken with the English common law. When he was a baron, King John asked that due process under this unwritten English common law replace the arbitrary will of the king's minister. And unsurprisingly, John forgot about due process when he became king. Baldwin further explains how the Magna Carta established the principle that the realm's written law should guide the king's rule and ensure that due process, aided by a council of barons and the law of the land, should apply not only to the king's court, but also to the king himself. The Great Charter prevented the king from arbitrarily depriving his vassals of life, liberty, and property without due process. Baldwin notes that there's a religious aspect to the Magna Carta. When King John refused to accept the papal appointment of Stephen Langston, the newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, the Pope responded by excommunicating the king until he relented. At Westchester, Archbishop Langston absolved King John of his excommunication on the condition that he swore to uphold the good laws of his ancestors, especially Edward the Confessor, and to eliminate unjust laws. He also demanded that King John swear to judge all people according to the fair rulings of his court. When John tried to avoid signing the Magna Carta, Archbishop Langston reminded him of his Winchester oath. He also grounded his support for the Magna Carta in Scripture. Langston insisted on a limited monarchy stemmed from his belief that politics was the consequence of the fall, and that the Old Testament elevated prophetic judges over kings. He often preached that a person should resist unjust laws that involved mortal sins, as such laws exceeded the legitimate sphere of government. When it was time to sign the Magna Carta, he reminded King John that God, the ultimate judge, is superior to any hierarchy of legally established authority. So the English concept of the rule of law is deeply biblical, ecclesial, theological, and political roots. In the US legal tradition, the rule of law is often explained, therefore, in terms of the English common law's procedural due process and safeguards. This is largely due to widespread legal philosophies that set the rules defined by legal institutions such as legislature as a norm. This legal philosophy is called legal positivism in the US legal tradition. Legal positivism holds that human beings and institutions create law without regard to morality. The law is simply a social fact without any ought or ethical standard. John Austin, a 19th century English lawyer, famously tied the law to the will of the sovereign in a particular society. For Austin, the law was merely a matter of political and historical decision-making as a sovereign. In response to Austin, Herbert Lionel Adolphus, H.A.L. Hart, he never used his full name, wrote The Concept of Law. Hart argued that the true ground of the law was a rule of recognition. For Hart, the community as a whole must accept a fundamental master rule, that is, a rule of recognition, that gives particular people and institutions the power to make law. The following example might help clarify the difference. For Austin, if the President of the United States starts a military operation of war in a foreign nation, the action is legal because the President is the commander-in-chief. That's Austin. For Hart, the legality of the president's warfighting depends on whether the people of the United States accept the president's authority to do so. For Hart, laws are defined not by exercise of sovereign power, but by popular recognition. And while Hart introduces a much-needed relational element to the concept of law, he nevertheless divorces the law from morality and the rule of law, in my opinion. In both forms of legal positivism, the law is defined by people, and people prone to act unjustly, either through power or recognition. The rule of law insists that we have a government ruled by laws and not by men. Natural law insists that the law has a moral dimension. US legal philosopher Ronald Dworkin offers one of the best philosophical explanations of the concept of the law under a secular natural law perspective. In Law's Empire, Dworkin argues that the law does not depend solely on matters of plain historical fact. He contends that the law, quote, is our most structured and revealing social institution. If we understand the nature of our legal arguments better, we know better what kind of people we are, unquote. The law has characterological aspects. It reveals a society's moral character. The United States Constitution codified a commitment to a rule-bound governance through separation of law and enumerated powers. And for Dworkin, the law is integrity. The law is not, quote, the backward-looking factual reporting of conventionalism or the forward-looking instrumental program of legal pragmatism. No, says Dworkin. The law is an ongoing and relentless interpretation of an unfolding political narrative that combines both backward and forward-looking elements. The law is both a collection of, that sounds like biblical scholarship to me. The law is both past decisions and a scheme of principles that justify them. Law as integrity, says Dworkin, begins in the past and pursues the past only so far as in the way its contemporary focus dictates. It does not seek to revisit the practical intent of previous legal rulings, but instead to contextualize them within a broader narrative that continues to be convincing today. He describes the law as a chain novel, where each generation acts as a novelist, picking up the story from the previous generation to add to it in ways that makes the work seem like it was created by a single author rather than many. For Dworkin, the interpretive act of law as integrity is supported by another characteristic of an even greater law characterized by an even greater integrity. The law is defined by pure integrity, which consists of principles of justice and fairness. Dworkin characterizes justice as achieving the correct outcome of the political system, which involves the proper allocations of goods, opportunities, and resources. And fairness, on the other hand, pertains to designing the appropriate structure for that system, especially the framework that correctly distributes the influence over political decision ways. He's more of a distributive justice type of guy. Justice and fairness are morally charged principles that purify the law as integrity. Quote, present law gropes towards pure law when the mode of decision appears to seem that seems to satisfy fairness and process and bring the law closer to its own ambition, unquote. Purified interpretations of the law speak directly to the character of the community. Dworkin's account resonates with Catholic virtue ethics, in my opinion. Virtue ethics is a teleological ethic of character. In general, it raises three fundamental questions about a society or an individual. Who are we? Who should we become? And how do we get there? In Christianity, Jesus Christ is the telos, and the Christian should seek to be more like Christ and recognize that, quote, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, unquote, Romans 3:23. And for the Catholic Christian, the rule of law requires, I believe, vulnerability, honesty, and integrity. Why? Because as 1 John 1:8-10 puts it, if we say that we have no sins, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. If we confess our sins, he who is faithful and just will forgive us our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. If we say that we have not sinned, we make him a liar, and his word is not in us. In line with Levinson's understanding of covenant, the rule of law requires humility. It requires an honest assessment of who we are as a nation prior to God's unmerited favor of grace. Missing from Dworkin's secular natural law account of the law is a recognition that society lacks the capacity to grasp pure integrity, the principles of justice and fairness without the grace of God. In a concluding section, I present another school of legal thought, legal realism, which invites us to consider the character of the United States and the rule of law with gratitude and humility. Part 3, Civil War, Union, and Reconstruction, Constitutional Reconstitution. Legal realism was developed mainly in the US American law schools. Like positive lawyers, legal realists insist that people and politics shape the law. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. stands as a towering figure in legal realism. In his book, The Common Law, Holmes said, quote, "The life of the law has not been logic, it has been experience." the felt necessity of the time, the prevailing moral and political theories, the institution of public policy, avowed or unconscious, and even the prejudice which judges share with their fellow men, have had a good deal more to do with syllogism in understanding the rules by which men should be governed. For Holmes, shared experiences shape the law. Crisis and conflict, prejudice and pride play a huge role in how we interpret the law. Critical race theorists are legal realists who argue that racial hierarchies and white supremacy are baked into our national story, identity, and the rule of law. They refuse to separate the rule of law from a people and a society, even if that society is racist. In 1877, 1 year after the 100th anniversary of the United States, the US Congress abandoned all efforts at Reconstruction under the so-called Compromise of 1877. The preamble of the United States Constitution says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our prosperity, we do ordain and establish this Constitution. The aspiration, quote, to form a more perfect union, unquote, signals an orientation toward refinement rather than rupture. And the US Civil War constituted a violent adjudication of whether the Union was irrevocable. To settle the dispute about the 1876 presidential elections, Republicans agreed to withdraw federal troops from the former Confederate states and to allow white supremacist Democrats to enact a reign of terror over Black citizens. Abraham Lincoln had long rejected the compact theory of succession and construed the Union as dissolvable. And after the Civil War, the Supreme Court affirmed Lincoln's theory about the Union's indestructible character in Texas versus White. Like Israel's covenant, the constitutional union was interpreted as a binding covenant beyond breach. To ensure the rule of law through the Union, radical Republicans enacted constitutional reforms embodied in the 14th, 13th, and 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which redefined US citizenship, justice, fairness, and equality. These amendments reconstituted the Union as a moral community committed, at least textually, to equal protection and political inclusion. However, the rollback of the Reconstruction via Jim Crow regimes shows that constitutional texts depend on ongoing political commitment. The analogy to covenantal permanence is instructive, though limited. While the Reconstruction amendments function similarly as covenant renewal, an attempt to enact constitutional law with integrity, they articulate a normative aspiration while exposing the gap between profession and performance. Celebrating 100 years of Black history reminds us that understanding our constitutional history should include voices from every level of society. Covenant emphasis on remembering slavery and the Exodus parallel how the United States also should cherish the importance of recalling chattel slavery and acts of resistance in its collective memory. The legitimacy of the law depends on honest storytelling. The distinction between sacred covenant and secular constitution is both necessary and provisional. Catholic political theology, as articulated in Gaudium et Spes and Dignitatis Humanum, affirms political autonomy while denying moral self-sufficiency. The state is not salvific, yet it remains accountable to transcendent norms. And Christian nationalism collapses this tension. It mistakenly equates the nation's identity with divine purpose. On the other hand, viewing secularism as merely moral neutrality can make political life feel less accountable ethically. The Jewish Deuteronomy, theology, and Catholic virtue ethics in the vein of Blackness touch on all these points and avoid both extremes. U.S. jurisprudence has oscillated among positive, natural law, and realist paradigms. While legal positivism distinguishes law's validity from moral evaluation, natural law reasoning grounds legal legitimacy and moral universality, and legal realism foregrounds social contingencies. Despite divergences, all accounts presuppose the necessity of norm-governed order for communal endurance. In this respect, American constitutionalism mirrors covenantal logic. Community requires durable public norms and a virtue ethic that humbly takes our checkered past seriously. At 250 years old, U.S. constitutionalism faces the ongoing challenge of a tension between norm and power, aspiration and actuality. And the Hebrew Bible's combination of covenant and law provides a helpful framework for understanding community resilience through binding norms rooted in previous commitments. It's important to keep the analogy clear and disciplined. The Constitution is a political agreement among people, not a covenant with God. However, both traditions understand that true freedom requires structure and that authority needs to be balanced with limitation. The covenantal imagination insists that fidelity is an ongoing achievement. A more perfect union, like covenantal holiness, is never simply inherited. It must be enacted again and again through the disciplined submission of the rule of law. A charge to keep I have, a God to glorify. Oh, let me not my trust betray, but press to realms on high. Thank you.
Good evening to everybody. I feel woefully inadequate to respond to this paper, but I am thankful for the opportunity. So Dr. Ritchie has written a timely and thought-provoking and interdisciplinary paper that seeks to attend to America's own, what I will call, double consciousness in view of her semi-centennial celebration that does indeed coincide with, quotes, disputes over congregational delegations, presidential authority, legitimate war fighting, voter suppression, and economics uncertainty, and much more. And so I appreciate Dr. Ritchie's interrogation of how communities are held together and maintained by norms, and how those norms are informed by notions of justice and fairness. His appeal to covenantal love as a public grammar that grounds a relational fidelity feels appropriate. It feels right, especially as one not having a law degree. And Byron, you definitely, if there was any doubt, I definitely want to go back and study law because of this paper, right? So but what you're communicating, right, it feels right, being a non-technician in terms of legal jurisprudence. For me, this public grammar is about formation, right? How are we shaping and being shaped? And I'll say a little bit more about that in a few minutes. In the case of the law, how are we shaping it, and how is the law, and how is it also shaping us? Dr. Ritchie's final section on the aspirations and limits of American rule of law was instructive, especially when considering those limits against a creation that is contingent, sinful, and racist as its backdrop. Dr. Ritchie employs the idea of covenantal logic and grammar rooted in Israel's unique relationship to Yahweh as a framework for understanding the law. He says, in reference to this covenantal logic, the covenant's legal dimension is grounded in the affective and moral response to give thanks for God's hesed, or God's love. the legal dimensions of the law are properly seen as a virtue ethic of gratitude, end quote. And so theorizing the connections between covenantal logics inspired by the Hebrew Bible and the law creates space for thinking about the moral and effective dimensions that are always already at work in America's legal framework, as well as how our legal logics and grammar constitute relationships. It seems to me that questions about formation and subjectivity are at the forefront of covenantal logics to the degree that law shapes dimensions of life and thought. The law informs realities, beliefs, dispositions, feelings, sentiments, and our perception of reality, beliefs, dispositions, feelings, and sentiments also inform our articulations of the law. And so if legal grammar communicates or maybe even reflects a vision of reality, convictions, and commitments too, then does reform in the American context mean being something other than how Americans have understood what it means to be American? Maybe put it another way, can America be great for once? Or is she too racist to reform? I have my doubts that she can be something other than what she has been for the last 250 years. And this current administration does not give me pause for my pessimism. The question about formation and potential reformation leads me to consider the structural vulnerability within America's commitment to the rule of law. And so again, Byron, thank you for kind of teasing this out and making this make some sense. I locate myself as a legal realist using Dr. Ratti's framework. I do believe, as he says, quote, racial hierarchies and white supremacy are baked into the national story, identity, and the rule of law, end quote. And I refuse to think in abstractions by separating the rule of law from the experiences of people in the world and in society. And so Dr. Ratti highlights the significance of 1877 and the congressional abandonment of Reconstruction and other important historical moments that suggest reading them through a lens of reform and not rupture. Dr. Ratti is correct, I believe, about the need for ongoing political commitment when he says the analogy to covenantal permanence is instructive, though limited. And while the Reconstruction Amendments function similarly to covenant renewal, an attempt to enact constitutional law with integrity, they articulate a normative aspiration while exposing the gap between profession and performance, end quote. But one of the questions that I want to raise is, if we take race seriously, is white supremacist logic so baked into the fabric of the legal system that it is at home in the contradiction or in the gap, right? Is that a safe space where it is allowed to function and thrive? It seems to me that race and white supremacy that is also baked into the legal system seems to be at home with contradictions or with that gap, right? And then lastly, and hopefully, again, we can talk more about some of these. I'm just trying to raise some questions. Lastly, structural vulnerability makes me think about the possibility of regression. Because U.S. jurisprudence moves between paradigms and U.S. constitutionalism faces the ongoing challenge of tensions between norms and power, aspirations and actuality, I wonder if regression seems to be a persistent threat to closing the gap that Dr. Ratti mentions. Just as sin is always trying to reassert itself, the gains made in these historical moments are always under threat, the threat of erasure, right? So thinking about the transition or the move from slavery into the Jim Crow era and how, slavery kind of takes on another name, right? Or how it continues to function under a different kind of name, right? Where this threat seems to reinscribe itself, right? Not just in kind of popular culture, but also in many ways through the legal apparatus. Maybe a contemporary example of this is much of the rollbacks that we've seen in terms of DEI and other kind of affirmative action or race-based policies, right, that had legal support, right, or even attempts to repeal 13th, 14th, and 15th, or the voting rights amendments, I should put it that way, right, and how through the legal system there is an attempted kind of regression or a going back, right? And so I think in that sense, one of the things that I really appreciate about Dr. Ratti's paper or essay is the way that he does acknowledge, right, the continued fight or the continued struggle in the midst of this, right? That to secure it in one age or one moment or one historical period does not guarantee that legal right would continue to be perpetuated in subsequent generations, right? And so I think that need for that continued fight is extremely important. Right, so the gains that are made are always under the threat of erasure. So again, thinking about slavery, Jim Crow, and even kind of post-Obama America. African-American critical theorists like Calvin Warren and Michelle Wright, who promote a political ontology that views certain kinds of people as instruments of the state and legal apparatus, may be informative for thinking about this kind of regression, right? That in there, thinking about race and thinking about specifically anti-Black racism, how Blackness kind of takes a subject position, right, that leaves it open for different forms of violence, right, but also this kind of instrumentalization, right, at the hands of the state and through the kind of legal apparatus, right, that puts the weight on the lives, stories, and experiences of African Americans and people of color in order to instrumentalize them and to use them, and many times to demonize them. And so, in conclusion, I really, really appreciated reading this paper because, one, as a not someone trained in legal theory, it was helpful in terms of being able to enter into the mind of a legal theorist and a scholar of religion. But this paper also helps me to think about some things that I have been thinking about and wanting to write about. And so it was difficult in terms of thinking of a response without just saying amen to everything that Dr. Ratti said. And so I'm looking forward to continued dialogue and questions in order that I may also continue to learn about these intersections. So thank you.
Dr. Ratti, thank you so much for your paper this evening and for being willing to share an advanced copy with your respondents. I have to say, as a biblical scholar, I often get a little bit uncomfortable on the front end when someone talks about using biblical models for government. But as you aptly note, biblical models are founded on a sort of explicit enmeshment between religious and political leadership and on belief in divine appointment of rulers. So on that note, I really appreciated your careful guardrails at the front around the uses of your analogy. And despite my sometime unease with the use of biblical models, a commitment to interreligious pluralism is a crucial founding value of our nation, even if this value has always been imperfectly enacted. And interreligious pluralism can only function well if people are willing to disclose and discuss the values that they bring from their own traditions and worldviews. So for me, as a Christian and a citizen, this means some disclosure of how I process my own ethical convictions in conversation with and influenced by the Bible. So I wouldn't say to a fellow citizen, you have to follow this policy because it's in the Bible, But I might say my reflection on the Bible informs a value based on which I'll advocate or vote for a policy that I think is best for both of us. And I believe in pluralism because I think it is required for democracy. And I also think that it's a value supported by my own faith tradition's commitment to universal human dignity. And pluralism requires us to bring our own deepest values into our collaborations and compromises across differences for the common good. So your consideration of ongoing fidelity to a binding covenant as a feature of biblical texts is a really interesting touch point for your consideration of legal thinking in the United States today. And another thing that I think is valuable about this discussion is how you've put Catholic virtue ethics here in conversation with Levinson's Jewish theological interpretations of covenant, and the ideal of enduring transcendent principles versus the imperfection of human laws, I think is a really fruitful topic for further and wider interfaith discussions that can also be inclusive of non-religious people as well. I have one point building on your points and two questions in my response. And all of these push a little further into biblical studies. And I thank Dr. Price for covering more of the systematics and ethics side of things. So building on your ideas about love and covenant theology, something that I think adds to your discussion is that Jack Lapsley has also built on Moran's work to think about the affective dimensions of love for God in Deuteronomy. And she draws on Martha Nussbaum and Antonio Damasio to point out how modern virtue ethics can emphasize, and maybe you're already familiar with this article. Cultivating the right emotive responses in order to take the right actions, and how affect and action are reciprocal. I don't really read what she's saying as at odds with Levinson per se. But Levinson identifies gratitude or prior gratitude as sort of this affective dimension of obedience to laws, while Lapsley focuses more on how adherence to laws can cultivate affect, which is a different question than Levinson takes up. And so I wonder whether this affective dimension of covenant language has any analogs. This is a sort of separate question. I wonder whether this affective dimension of covenant language has any analogs in the way that legal scholars and systematic theologians think about writing laws today. And I think this point might connect to discussions about how laws, like the Reconstruction Amendments, shape behavior, but behavior can also shape attitudes. And I think there's a famous MLK Jr. quote about, you can't legislate morality, but you can legislate behavior. And what's underneath that is behavior can change how people morally think. And so then both the questions that I have for you this evening are, to a certain extent, about what to do with the inequities and messiness of the laws included in biblical covenants. So my first question is about the comparison between the memory of the Exodus and slavery as a formative narrative for biblical legal codes, to this comparison to honest storytelling about the history of slavery in the US. And this is a comparison that makes sense to me at one level, and I recognize the Exodus as a really important component of African American liberation theology. Also, the history of oppression in Egypt in biblical texts is understood as an external sin against the people of Israel, and they define themselves in separation from Egypt. And the history of slavery and racism in the US is more of an internal sin. And even for African Americans who are the descendants of enslaved people, the positionality of narrating this might be a bit different because they remain in the country that oppressed them and claim, at least theoretically, even if it's often denied, equal citizenship within the very same country. And you mentioned the Reconstruction Amendments as examples of reform. And I note that every time there's a covenant renewal ceremony in biblical texts, there's acknowledgement that the people have completely failed to keep the covenant. So my question is whether in this context of your paper, there might be other narratives as well, for instance, like the covenant renewal ceremonies in passages like 2 Kings 22 and 23, or Nehemiah 9 and 10, that offer further analogs. And my second question is, what does it do to us or for us to label biblical covenants as divine, eternal, or binding, and maybe to simultaneously grapple with the fact that biblical legal codes in the covenant are profoundly unequal. Levinson makes the point that the legal norms have acquired the status of covenantal stipulations. So these covenants certainly enact a divine human hierarchy, but they also assert a set of human hierarchies that, from what we can tell in biblical texts, would probably result in harms that are not entirely unlike those enacted by the US Constitution. And Levinson deals with this complication some in his final chapter. Biblical legal codes are written with elite men and heads of households as their main subjects and protagonists. Women are, for instance, to a large extent, not the subjects or arbiters of their own sexual decision-making. And foreigners are sometimes exempted, often exempted, from some of the most radical economic visions of equality, and also what we might consider some of the most humane protections of biblical legal codes. So, for instance, they're excluded from many of the laws of the Jubilee in Leviticus 25. Prophetic texts do sometimes address failure to treat other people with justice as a covenant issue, but even these texts do not necessarily in themselves challenge the unequal hierarchies such as xenophobia or sexism that we see in biblical covenants, or the laws attached to biblical covenants. And Levinson's project is focused on exploring a sort of transcendent dimension of the command to love God. So I think I can see why he doesn't focus on these issues. But for your project, I wonder whether grappling with the all too human failings of the legal system in biblical texts, either in the narratives of covenant failure and renewal or in the inequities of the codes themselves, might offer further food for reflection on how we understand our relationship to the law today, and whether it might be another space to expand the dimensions of the analogy that you draw. And I'm thinking also here about people like the political scientist Danielle Allen, who talks about the promises and failures of the Constitution. She is herself the descendant of enslaved people, and she writes about the promise of what can be found in the Constitution that also codified slavery. She says, "The Constitution is a work of practical genius. It is morally flawed. The story of the expansion of human freedom is one of shining moral ideals, besmirched by the ordure of ongoing domination. I muck the stalls. I find a diamond. I clean it off and keep it. I do not abandon it because of where I found it." End quote. And I think this sort of way of thinking that you are expressing might also have a lot of touch points with how we relate to the Bible and its claims today. So to close, I'd like to toss out what I hope is a fun provocation. I read the Constitution this morning, and I noted that it has, not for the first time, but hadn't in about a year. I noticed that it has almost no affective language in it, maybe faithfully in the presidential oath and duties. And it has no real direct narrative, although we could say among our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence has some narrative, but that narrative is focused pretty exclusively on the wrongdoings of King George. So my question, as very much a non-specialist in contemporary legal ethics, is would you support an amendment to the text of the Constitution that added historical narrative or affective language as a foundation for legal and or moral action today? For instance, should we be humbled by narratives of our nation's original sins, like the genocide of indigenous peoples and the institution of racialized chattel slavery? Should we be grateful for rights we have, like the freedom of religion, assembly, speech, the press, all those good things in the Bill of Rights? Should we command people to love everyone within our borders? If you would support an amendment adding narrative or affective language, what would you add? Or if you wouldn't, why not?
All right. Thank you all three. We are going to give Byron an opportunity now to respond to our two brilliant panelists. Are you ready?
Yeah.
All right.
I have a quick question.
We'll then move to an open.
Yes. I'll go backwards. Would I add narrative? Yes. I think that would be, in fact, that's why I mentioned the preamble, because it's pretty much the only really aspirational narrative that we have in the Constitution. And you're right about the oath of office. That's the only place which the presidential oath of office matches the oath that every member of the federal government takes to be faithful to the Constitution, from the lowest little private in the Army all the way to everyone. We all say the same oath. So I'm thinking about that. What would I add? I think we would need at least a sort of like this Deuteronomy passage that I read, where it's, you didn't do this. A narrative that assures that we have, and not just we, yes, we, both black, white, everybody that's here, you didn't build this. This was stolen. The genius, we're trying so hard now in African American studies to show how the contact between Africa and Europe was medieval. And so the selection of who was taken from Africa was not just random throwing people on ships. They went and targeted specific knowledges, people who had the skill for, in my hometown, not my home state of South Carolina, where we grow rice and indigo. That was the Chinese knew how to do that, and so did West Africans. So they took everyone from South Carolina and Georgia who can trace their ancestry back to the Civil War. You're probably from Liberia and Sierra Leone, because those people had the technology. They had the mindset. And they didn't take 50-year-olds. They took 12, 14, and 16-year-olds. So we built this. This was a failed project until enslaved Africans brought their genius over here. The same thing with our Native people. They helped us to figure out how to do this. We would have died. All of the original colonists would have died if the natives hadn't stepped in to help them figure out how to survive. So it's just this long narrative about conquest but also just of gratefulness to all the peoples, indigenous, talking about our borders, how one of the issues when it comes to the immigration issue is not realizing how long Latino Americans have been in this country and how our borders have expanded and taken over their indigenous lands and ways. So it's and then even the idea of the Americas itself, to claim an identity as Americans without realizing how much of that is things. So yeah, I think we need some form of a narrative before the preamble that kind of sets up who we are as a people and specific instructions that judges and lawyers think about the law in light of this history. There's a move within legal, this positivist things, this originalist movement that is happening largely because of Justice Scalia and his insistence that history is the way to do this. And so if the good lawyers don't fight, there's a Supreme Court. I don't believe in undoing precedent, unlike other people. This is the precedent. If you want to establish these rules for interpretation, then we need to establish what history actually matters, what history governs the interpretation of our laws and our documents. So I would love a historical narrative that judges are now required to use in order to think about the history of our country. The other piece, the Nesbaum, thank you. Yes, I think he did some of that, but he skipped over it too quickly, about the affect and how actions, just doing the law itself, following the mitzvah actually cultivates a certain type of affectiveness. But he wanted to make the larger point of things. But I agree with you. You said Nesbaum and Jack, and I was like, okay, that I could do that. The biblical models for governing are problematic. And in fact, one of the biggest issues, and if I had in a larger work, I would address this, is the over-reliance on the Exodus narrative by Black liberation theologians. That is a womanist scholars have over and over again reminded us how much that can lead to patriarchal notions and over emphasizing liberation when it really doesn't happen. And I think you pointed that out quite well. The Exodus didn't occur. We didn't leave. Some of us did. Tried to go back, but it didn't work. And some of us tried to go to Mexico, and that didn't work. So it just there's this Laney tradition that we need to think through. And then Andrew, Dr. Price said that's good. I'm really helpful. It helped me to think through this question of structural vulnerability when it comes not just to the norms itself, but to the gains, to how that's a sense, that's a deep feeling that we all need to think. I probably will have to go back and imagine that within as a Black theologian, like what is the vulnerability that African Americans are feeling? Because that's an ignored thing that would need to be brought to the surface, because it'll probably get to the thing. We're the ones that we didn't have we've always had other immigrants of color people of color in this country, but we don't get a large, wide scale number of non-Black immigrants until 1960s, 1970s with the Immigration Reform Act, changing that. So most of the civil rights that we have is the work of Black, Indigenous, and Latino folks just pressing the issue over and over and over again with some of our Asian American friends too, after the Second War, who did that. So we need to think more. I need to think more deeply about what the existential crisis that Black people have had. After the election, a number of people were, Black women in particular, were just like, I'm going home to rest. I'm not doing anything else. I just need to take a break. And that's a sign not of just feeling sad because you lost, but I think what you're pointing to, there's the vulnerability about the erasure of well thought after gains. So yeah, thank you. I really appreciate all those questions. I can open up for anybody.
You want to sit back down here or you want to stay up there?
It doesn't make a difference.
Should I open up the big picture?
Yes, why don't you? Libby?
Sure.
It's not the right one.
Hold on one second.
Yeah, I'm Elizabeth Schrader-Polzer here at Villanova. I teach New Testament. I was interested in Dr. Price's highlighting of this concept of regression as a persistent threat, and it's almost something that can be predicted at this point. And actually have some inside experience because Dr. Ritchie and I went to hear Michael Curry preach at St. Thomas just a few weeks ago. It was awesome, by the way. Michael Curry, Bishop Curry, former presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church. And he was talking about regression there too in his sermon. He was saying, this has happened before, this has happened before. And he was really focused. The thing is that we felt amazing. We felt amazing at the end of that sermon. He gave us hope. He really brought hope in that sermon. And I'm curious if hope because you were also talking about how it's, you started your paper talking about the lived experience of Black people and how that can't be separated. And so I'm wondering, is there room in what you're crafting here to address regression, as Dr. Price brings up, and also to talk about how it needs to be brought, I guess, to the people generally, but I wonder if in Black churches, as we saw, because we, you and I literally witnessed that there is regression that's being acknowledged by one of the church leaders. And basically Michael Curry said, this has happened before, this has happened before, this has happened before, but you just keep on, you keep on. That was sort of the message. And he really drove it home. And it's almost like the experience of regression and the fact that things do move forward a little bit. Jim Crow isn't quite slavery, and the rollback of DEI isn't quite, Jim Crow. So I'm just wondering if there's room for that, addressing regression and the people in the current place? Or are you purposely keeping your paper away from like the present moment?
Yes, thank you for those. That's a wonderful question. One of the things so this is a part of y'all got a part of a larger project. This is my second book project on the Reconstruction Amendments as moral, a ground for moral theology. And in particular, what I'm trying to do is redeem the Republican Party. I'm trying to I worked for years as a Democrat for South Carolina Republicans and just have a lot of friends who are good, solid, faithful conservatives, and they're disillusioned. And so some of what I want to do is look at these people and say, you do know you're the party of radical Republicans. And all Black people were once Republicans because of the deep moral commitment to freedom that was the birth of the Republican Party. The Republican Party starts from this issue of slavery and abolition, and it's the Democrats that were so this and in any couple of years the story can turn because political parties aren't churches. They're what they are. And so to make that make more sense and to kind of read, I remember sitting in law school and thinking, we're treating this, the son of a preacher, lifelong Christian. And I'm like, we're reading this almost like it's scripture. And had several other I took a track that most lawyers don't take. Most people are just learning how to practice the law. I studied jurisprudence and law and religion, and a bunch of other classes that were more philosophical in nature. Because it was clear to me that in terms of this dispute about whether morality has a place in the law, I couldn't see how the answer couldn't be yes. It just is all, we don't detach our morality from ourselves and just kind of just operate only in our heads. We're humans, we're beings. And the people who crafted this document, crafted our Constitution, crafted laws, their morality is always at play. And what can be helpful for them, especially in this period as more and more Christian nationalist rhetoric is being spread around what it means to be a nation, is to offer some type of thoughtful, responsible way for people who understand the Bible as being important to their life. To say, we don't want you to equate this, we don't want you to make this type of equation. But yes, the logic, I can see how you brought some of this biblical way of thinking into the way that you see your moral life and our lives as a thing. And part of that, I think, I'm glad you brought this up, would require me and others who are trying to point this out to say, yes, and the Bible itself has some problems when it comes to a political vision and covenant. And so there's no perfect anything. There's no perfect union. There's no perfect covenant, really, in the biblical text. And that's the whole point of it, that we're striving with God to do something that creates deep belonging in all the imperfect ways it is. So the vulnerability has to be key, I think, in any future parts of this. Yes.
Hi, thank you for an incredibly sort of rich paper. My name is John Ahn. I teach at Howard University. Yeah, so meet you.
You know.
So I teach Hebrew Bible, and I do a lot of Africana theory as well too. And I do read enough Black consciousness right now. So it sounds so much like Gooding Williams right now, what you're presenting right now. And you see where I'm going with my question already. In other words, beauty, positivism, in terms of all the honorability, the humility, okay? if you study and examine covenantal theology, as you were talking about, the suzerainty treaty, we always have the vassal. It's always the underclasses. It's the oppressed, right? So when you go through all the covenantal theology, and Levinson stops as a Jew, but as Christians, we move on, right? And as Christians, when we move on with covenantal theology, for those of us, or those of you who are Catholic, as you say, it ends with the blood of Christ, the new covenant. It's pretty messy. There's nothing positive about that. Okay, legal positivism, right? Legal positivism, when there's something wrong with it, you're constantly creating new laws because there's something wrong with our previous laws. So there is this constant repeating or redoing of the law. In other words, there's not enough cabral in what you just presented. There's just not enough the negative movement in what you just presented that speaks to the pathos. There's just not enough blackness, if I can use that. I know I'm not black, okay? But again, after the Exodus, sure, we get that as well too. Cohen's biggest mistake, it stops at the Exodus, right? What comes after the Exodus? But there's just not enough blackness that would pass the mustard at a place like Howard. It just wouldn't fly. And so what would you say to those critical Black theorists who are listening and wanting to hear more of Black consciousness, Africana critical theory in your presentation?
I would say I'm with you. I had a little bit of time, so I was trying to focus more. One of the reasons I stuck with Levinson, because I've also been looking at, so I've been trying to look through covenant. I spent a good bit of time. I usually focus on Paul's letter to the Galatians when I'm thinking about what covenant should mean for Christians, in large part because it's an authentic letter. It's early, it's very early. And I'm weary of anti-Semitism. I'm very scared so part of me just sticking with Levinson is like, let me appreciate the covenant solely on Jewish terms. And to feel this and to understand it, to see Jewish folks in America as ontologically Black, as people who are oppressed in their own way, and to just sit with this ontologically Black community and in their notions of covenant. And in a very pluralistic and interfaith way, take what I can learn from them back to my own Catholic Christian community. And when I ask students about covenant theology or what they think about the covenant, they never ground it in anything Jewish. They go straight to Jesus dying on the cross. And what they can remember and hear in the Mass, which is, this is the blood of the new covenant, which has been shed for you. So that image of sacrifice and thing, I think that's dominant in the Christian imagination, not the Jewish Jesus who's thinking about how this is connected to Israel's identity of loving commitment, loving community with a God that is their leader, that is leading them in all the ways that will keep them landed and liberated. So that would be the first thing I would tell my Black brothers and sisters. Let's spend some time with our Jewish friends first, because we too participate in anti-Semitism, and we need to stop for a moment before we just center ourselves in everything, and then to move forward with, to me, in other parts, the new covenant. So what does this look like? And in addition to Galatians, I've been looking at Martin Luther's commentary on Galatians. Most Black Christians are Protestant, not Catholic. I'm interjecting as a Catholic. So it would make sense to just pause for a moment and see what this dominant understanding of the notion of covenant feels like for your average Black Christian, and then move that forward. And in each phrase, I think Black theology is liturgical. So that would mean, and Dolores Williams outlines that by liturgical, you have to have a liturgical intent. You must think about what Black life looks like within the liturgy, within the way that we worship. So that's why I started with songs. But to me, it's prayer, it's sermons. Like at every moment to go back and Bishop, you stole some thunder because I'm trying to find his sermon again to see, as we celebrated the first Black priest in the United States, Absalom Jones, how at this moment, how did we find hope? How did this community of African Methodists, Catholics, Episcopalian, Black people, just Black folks, sitting in here remembering our ancestors, how did we think back on this and say, we have been here before, we will not lose hope, we will not despair. It's not an option for people committed to the covenant. So as I'm thinking through the book, which is 10, 15 years down the road, I'm just, at every moment, I'm just thinking, how do we, every chapter would have to start with coming back to the church, coming back into our liturgy and grounding it there. That may not be a thing because we have so many people who are leaving the church, they don't like it and they're over with it. But I'm a Christian. And I think that there's not another space as powerful as the ecclesia. That you can't brunch your way into hopefulness. You gotta come be with people around the word. But they would argue with me. I know my Howard folks, they would argue.
Hi, I'm Nathan, Villanova, doctoral student. So, I mean, I was just thinking of the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus uses 6 case studies to show how the law reveals like wisdom underneath it. But that was my initial question. But then he brought up the fact, like, let's stay with our Jewish brothers and sisters in the Old Testament and develop from that kind of wisdom tradition. And I'm wondering how that might play in your paper and discussing how law can become problematic, but there is wisdom to be gleaned from it as well.
Yeah, as I'm outlining this little book and I'm thinking about it, I have a love-hate relationship with Pope Benedict, but I think Jesus of Nazareth is just fine work, and he's like a model for me in terms of a systematic theologian who just takes seriously historical critical methods and work. And he also did in that first book of his for Jesus of Nazareth, where he is engaged with Rabbi Nasser in trying to understand what the distinctiveness, what makes Jesus so distinct from Moses. Like, why is this new Moses a thing? So at some point we do have to just admit who we are. We're Christians, and I'm a Catholic Christian. So to move forward in that. Maybe asked me to present something, and I was like, I got something, but I should have said, and it's a part of a larger thing. So you've just gotten a lot, but I'm thinking through all of this. Like, what does this look like from a biblical, historical, covenantal place for Catholics, for Black people, for Luther, for Paul, just what is covenant? What is belong? Because covenant to me is beyond just these laws. It's deep belonging. It's deep belonging. But I might be wrong.
This is Peter Spitaler, Villanova University. I have a question for you. In your response to a colleague earlier, you said you basically stopped with Levinson and didn't go to Galatians. And I'm wondering why. So if we agree that Galatia is an authentic letter of Paul, and Paul an authentic Jew,
yes,
right? Why would you play Paul off against Levinson in terms of seeking a Jewish context for covenantal thought?
I may have to put. That's a very good question. It's really not Paul. I don't have a problem with Paul, but it's the reception of Paul that makes me pause. Even though Levinson's going way past Paul with rabbinic and Buber, it would make all the sense in the world to say, okay, what did this first century Jew have to say about the nature of the covenant and why it has to there has to be a new one that kind of includes Gentiles. I think that is a response. And again, around this logic that I'm already seeing as I'm studying what covenant means, belonging. How do we get more people drafted in to this without being beholden to circumcision and other types of law? The logic it makes sense. The logic makes sense. And that logic of belonging, of humility, of gratitude, especially for the Christ, I think Paul rightly is centering, and it sounds a lot like Levinson in terms of his focus on grace. Levinson really almost at certain points using very Christian language in order to explain this. Like, it's grace and works. It's things. I think it's responsible, but I just know some of my teachers are very clear about this. Like that, who are you? I'm not talking to Paul nor to Levinson. There's somebody else that's going to be reading this, and I'm taking into account anti-Semitism. I just think it's pervasive, like racism. I think it's baked in, and we just have to. The Danbury Baptists, the Jewish communities that had to fight their way to a compromise in order for us to even get a constitution. It's just really baked in, and I'm guarding against my own thing. Kathy Caveney, I probably need to. You're going to make me think more deeply about that. As always, like there's a level of complicity. We're all complicit in some way, and to be sensitive to that is an act of humility. It's an act of virtue. The prophetic can't always just be, as Kathy's always telling me, everything can't be prophetic, Byron. You have to, you have to draw people in other ways. But I think there's a level of complicity in anti-Semitism with Judaism that we just can gloss over sometime. All of my students, every class I teach here at Villanova, we read Nostra Aetate, and I talk about the good of it and the bad, like at every point, because I'm not going to just be the person that is just streaming racism only for Blackness. It has to be. We have to see how deeply problematic this has been for our whole consciousness as a people. If we want to be a people, this can end. I'm not committed to them just staying. We don't have to be a nation. Nations come and make the Roman Empire hasn't. This is just not guaranteed to last. But if you want to be a people, to stay as a people, then you have to work. You have to work out that in my mind, with the spiritedness of a covenantal logic. Thank you, Bible scholars. Some of us are reading you. Yeah.
5 minutes, 3 minutes.
Hi, thanks very much for your presentation. I heard 3 chapters in there, so I don't think we're 10 years away, I hope.
Oh, there was.
I hope we're going to see something earlier. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I found it very inspiring. It reminded me, I felt echoes of Sanford Levinson's Constitutional Faith. I don't know if it's a book familiar to you, but it's a very interesting read on some reflexes between the Constitution and the Bible. I have a small comment that I want to make, which is to be careful about your use of Levinson.
Yeah.
Levinson, he's got a lot of stuff on. I hate to say this because I actually haven't read this particular book. I've read a lot of his stuff over the years. Gratitude or thanks is actually not prominent in Deuteronomy. The language that they use is to rejoice in, which is used about 7 times. They use Berach, you shall bless the Lord, which gets translated as thank the Lord. So there's a little interpretive move being made there. But to your point, to 2 of your points, Thanksgiving language is communal language elsewhere. The Todah offering is a liturgical thank you God kind of offering, which is in Leviticus, elsewhere in P material. And the root to thank is very commonly, of course, Hodu Ladonai Ki Tov, Ki Olam Chasdo, Psalm 136, through the whole thing. So your point about liturgical communal experience goes in that alley very beautifully with what you're trying to do. So don't let Levinson, Levinson's good. I like John a lot. He's written some very important books over the years.
Yes.
But I think that looking a little bit more, being expansive about your biblical search for your first chapter, whatever it's going to be, it can do a lot of good stuff for other aspects of what you're trying to get at. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful. I'll go talk with Ethan about that too. Ethan, but one of my colleagues said, but no, the liturgical piece that makes it's my Catholic impulse is definitely, Barakah. Let's give thanks that this is the way and the move to make. I think, to be fair to Levinson, when in the text it's not so much that gratitude piece is more towards the end, and it's rabbinic. He's clear that he's drawing. No.
Started to go through every reference to Deuteronomy, so maybe there is lurking there somewhere.
I think you might be right. I don't think I'm not even sure he's grounding it in Deuteronomy. I'm pretty certain he might be just doing a rabbinic interpretation. I'll go back but I have starred that to go back and make sure that I look at it. But yeah, he does. He's Levinson. He's doing a good job, and I figured, okay, he's helpful. But yes, this move to the liturgical is where I am. That's my bread and butter. I love church and I love the liturgy, and so it does make more sense to draw that out some more.
Amen.